Hello, and welcome to this episode of Strange as It Seems, a podcast about history, occultism, espionage, secret societies, mystery, conspiracy, and weirdness high and low. The common denominator is that the topics all embody the strange, that is, something that's unusual or surprising in a way that's unsettling or hard to understand. The aim is to reveal and discuss, but without any definite expectation of explaining or proving anything. Because, more often than not, the closer you look at the strange, the stranger it gets. Okay, well, finally, we're back for another episode of Strange as It Seems. And as seems all too often the case these days, I have to apologize for the length of time in between them.
That's me.
Well, it's
me.
It's a combination of things. Stephen has to earn a living, okay, and we're not earning it by doing this. And real life tends to get in the way. As interesting as what we're doing here may be. But we are back, and we were recording this episode, and should hopefully, at the time we're speaking, the Hanason, the Nazi Rasputin episode should be out, certainly before this one appears. So what we're here today to talk about is, my basic title for this episode would be Aleister Crowley in Hollywood, because you just can't say enough about Aleister Crowley, and Hollywood is always kind of a fascinating topic as well, and I'll explain more about that in a bit. But first, before we get going, I want to thank everyone who's subscribed, and if you're listening or watching and haven't subscribed, please do. That's you get this pitch all the time, so I'm making the same pitch.
I appreciate it.
The other people I want to thank in particular are our patrons. We have a modest but very helpful Patreon set up. One of the things that's allowed us to do is to get a second phone camera, so that now you can see Stephen. He is forced to expose himself to the world and to the slings and arrows of all the comments that we'll
find a better use for this camera than pointing it at me. But
okay, so if you're wondering why did I I bought him a coffee, what did I get for it? Well, this is it. You get to look at him. So
I've been ripped off.
You asked for it.
You asked for it,
and you've got it. So I want to thank everyone there. I hope I've thought of everyone properly. The other thing I want to do is that we do have a patron, a kind of sponsor, and as I mentioned that before, TrineDay Books, the finest in all alternative publishing. Really, I think in that regard, one of the most active and most interesting small publishing houses in the U.S. or in the world, for that matter. So I want to just give a brief pitch for a couple of newer books that have come out. One of them is by David W. Mantic, MD, PhD, called JFK Was Killed by Consensus. Subtitled, Dealey Plaza Was Just the Final Stop.
Was that LBJ in the back? Oh, no.
Yes, that's LBJ giving the stink eye.
You've already won me over.
Giving the stink eye to John F. Kennedy. So this again is more JFK assassination conspiracy literature. This is what got the whole thing going. Let me do my due diligence here by reading a bit from the back. And this is, JFK was killed by consensus is not a theory. It is a verdict rendered by decades of suppressed evidence, forensic deception, and institutional complicity. In this gripping and iconoclastic investigation, David W. Mantic, MD, PhD, shatters the lone gunman myth by revealing the breadth of fraud perpetrated by those entrusted to protect the truth. With the trained eye of a physicist and radiologist, Mantic exposes altered autopsy x-rays, vanished photographic evidence, a swapped brain, and a carefully curated public narrative designed to conceal a coup carried out in broad daylight.
All right.
There you go. The second one does not involve the Kennedy assassination, at least directly, is The Great Pretense, a tour through the boneyard of the CIA's war on drugs. Or war for drugs, not on drugs, for drugs. This is by Bill Conroy. So again, I'll read a brief blurb. Drawing on 4 decades of investigative reporting, journalist Bill Conroy, traces a hidden history of covert operations, media manipulation, silenced whistleblowers, and institutional cover-ups that link the CIA, U.S. foreign policy, and the global narcotics trade. Moving from Southeast Asia during the Vietnam era to Central America, Colombia, and beyond, Conroy documents how clandestine alliances with traffickers repeatedly collided with and corrupted law enforcement, justice, and democratic accountability. So,
have you noticed we've gotten quite a few comments recently about parapolitics, like Peter Dale Scott?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm a fan. We did a bio one time, and I threw that in there. That's my bailiwick. Not so much these days, but would you want to explore some of this? More? Yeah. I think that'd be fun.
Okay.
Yeah.
Skullduggery.
Yeah, that's pretty much.
Well, what do you expect an intelligence agency to be up to? Okay. They're not running a kindergarten. So, Aleister Crowley in Hollywood. So why Aleister Crowley? Well, again, go back. Aleister Crowley, fairly or unfairly, gets credited with all kinds of things. And one of the things that some people have called me is a Crowley apologist. Which means that I'm saying things about Crowley that they think is making him sound less like the most wicked man in the world than, for one reason or another, they want him to be. Crowley is one of those guys that you can read in different ways. Again, I'd put this from the standpoint, and I'm not blowing smoke up anywhere. I'm not a Thelemite. I think Crowley's occult ideas are interesting, but I'm not really into them. That's not reason why whether or not he is a genuine magus, or whether he is a charlatan, in some respects really doesn't matter to me. The thing is that he's an interesting and influential character, any way that you look at it. So, I'm not trying to legitimize Crowley. I mean, it all goes back to explanation I've given here and elsewhere as to how I got interested in him, more or less on a whim in some ways. I inquired. I knew he was in the U.S. during World War I. I thought maybe the Army's Military Intelligence Division, the kind of FBI of its day, might have gotten some information about him. And it turned out there was a small file, and it turned out in that file there was a comment from the British consulate in New York that, amazingly in some ways, confirmed Crowley's contention afterwards that he had actually been working for British intelligence in some way during the war, even though he appeared to be a German propagandist. So that's what interested me, is that he, in that case, he was telling the truth. He wasn't telling all of the truth, but his basic statement was correct, and then that's subsequently been confirmed by other bits of evidence. So, including, by the way, I might mention, is that one of the most prestigious establishment institutions in the UK is the National Portrait Gallery. And there are a couple of paintings involving Crowley in that gallery, and you can go online and look at this. And if you go and look at under his name, and it has a little potted bio, and one of the things it describes him as British author, occultist, and then also it notes British intelligence. So that is the closest thing I've seen to establishment confirmation of his role in that. I don't think anybody put that there accidentally, and they certainly didn't get it because I told them so. So, oops, you may also notice that we're playing around with lighting, trying to just experiment with different things, so you just kind of have to hang on with the experiment. There we go. The light has returned.
Yeah, part of having a second camera is you're just going to see me get up all the time.
So Crowley has become in some ways, in spite of himself, a kind of cultural icon. You know, people can't stop mentioning the fact that he, along with a lot of other people, are on the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's album cover. He did exert one way or another a great deal of influence, sort of beginning in the 60s, and he's still mentioned. He's still a very topical individual. So among the various things that have been claimed about his influence is that he had, directly or indirectly, a great deal of influence in Hollywood, that he influenced films, he influenced directors, he influenced actors. You know, not that he was personally, this was long after he was dead, but that his writings, the idea of him as this kind of Luciferian iconoclast was something that was attractive to many people, that Aleister Crowley, when he was alive, and then the ghost of Aleister Crowley later, was in some way this looming presence in Hollywood. And I think one of the best ways to put it, and it's a book I'll reference a number of times in this episode, it's by Michael A. Hoffman II. Hold it up here.
Yeah.
And it is Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare, okay, which is an interesting book. Okay. I'm not vouching that it's true or claiming that it's false. I'm saying that it's an interesting book. And one of the things that's interesting is that it's noted here, just mentioned on page 204, that the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, which is Crowley's main sort of front organization, OTO members were engaged in screenwriting for Hollywood movies. Among the OTO's numerous Hollywood operatives was an MGM producer who used the alias M. Balkan. We'll come back to that. But it's also mentioned that OTO initiates authored mass market stories, especially science fiction, with subliminal occult themes published in popular books and magazines. And so what I mostly want to look at here is that what's the reality? I mean, what can we actually kind of document about that, as opposed to the claim that Crowley and that his initiates or followers were influential in popular culture through film, through science fiction that became film? Well, you know, what I like to do is to go back and look at the evidence, such as it is, and maybe draw some theories based upon that evidence, but see what you actually have to go by. Because the statement is made in this book, no source is actually given. So the way I want to do this is to, I guess one question might come up is that, well, was Aleister Crowley ever actually in Hollywood? Yes, he was. Once, briefly. For about 3 days in 1915, Aleister Crowley was actually in Hollywood. Now, what did he do there? Well, we'll look into that. We can't say too much about it, but he was actually there. He did have a physical presence. And in later years, particularly towards, in the last decade of his life, from the late 30s to his death in 47, it was one of the places he wanted to go back to, not because he seemed to like Hollywood. He only had one thing to say about it, which was quite negative. But he wanted to get out of war-torn London. I mean, during this time, he actually gets blitzed out of one house that he's in. And he'd like to get out of there, not just get out of, rainy, foggy London, but to get out of war-torn London and get to sunny Southern California, where he thought that his remaining followers there would feed and house him for the rest of his mortal existence. That never happened, even though there were actually plans, half made in any ways. There was actually the aspiration for years of trying to bring him back to Southern California, to bring him back to Hollywood as a place to spend his final years. And it's interesting as to why that never coalesced. So He was physically there. Now, what about Hollywood itself? Well, Hollywood is the dream factory. Hollywood was the center of the production of motion pictures. Motion pictures had a tremendous impact upon American popular culture. If you wanted to spread an idea, and the idea that Crowley always wanted to spread was Thelema, his doctrine, his new religious dispensation that he received from Aiwas, the Egyptian spirit, in 1904 in Cairo, the Book of the Law, which was the kind of new, it was going to be the kind of the new religion for the new Aeon of Horus, which was going to come in, sweep Christianity aside, and create this whole new order for the world. Something which did not happen in Crowley's lifetime. All current decadence aside, it does not seem to have actually happened yet. Who knows what the future may hold? But that was what Crowley wanted. He was always fixated on trying to find some kind of vehicle, some kind of means to get Thelemic ideas, his new religious philosophy, which again was basically summed up that do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will. Okay, which is much more new. What does that mean exactly? Well, that's what you have to spend all the time doing. So, because he thought that if these ideas were placed in front of people, not everyone, but it would begin this kind of mad rush towards Thelema. That all people had to do was to be made aware of these ideas, to be influenced by them, and to want to live under them. They simply had to, Thelema had to be advertised in some way. And so films were, you're never going to get a bigger audience for anything. I'd say personally, the other thing is that I think, as I've mentioned, I grew up in Central California. I did not grow up in the LA area. I grew up about 2 hours north of that. And what that meant is that while I didn't live there, I didn't see these places, all of our TV came from there. Okay, so what we saw basically were LA stations. And it sort of turned that whole area into this kind of almost mythical realm. I mean, it was like Whittier Boulevard and, Sunset Strip. Disneyland was down there. Knott's Berry Farm was down there. All the wonders of the world were somehow encompassed down below the Santa Susana Mountains in the very smoggy LA basin. But it took on this almost kind of mythical in atop to the kind of larger-than-life mythology of Hollywood. It had a kind of personal mythology for me. So I've always been kind of interested in that area, that in some ways was so close to where I grew up, a couple of hours drive away, and yet such another kind of world once you got there. So, enough about me, and more about Aleister Crowley in Hollywood. So, I said that he's only known, certainly, I don't think it would be any others, appearance there was in November 1915, basically between November 8th and the 11th. He got there on the 8th, he left on the 11th, went down to San Diego. Now, how can we be so precise with that? Well, because one of the things that Aleister Crowley helpfully did was to keep a diary, a kind of daily account of what he was doing, where he was going, who he was seeing. I mean, there were gaps in it. There were lots of gaps in it. But it's a pretty good accounting. And so what he was on, why does he end up there? Why does he show up in Hollywood in November 1915? Well, Crowley had come to the United States about a year before. He was involved in various sort of personal activities, mostly in pursuing his own constant quest for occult knowledge and spiritual enlightenment, and that involved the performance of rituals, of spiritual retreats. He goes on a number of those during his American stay. And then also his sort of on-again, off-again undercover work for British intelligence. So part of that seems to have involved he's very short of money, but then for some reason in the fall of 1915 he decides to go on a transcontinental trip. And so he will leave New York that fall, and he will travel through Detroit and Chicago, on to Minneapolis, St. Paul, all the way across the Trans-Canadian Railway to Vancouver and Victoria, and then down the West Coast to San Francisco, and then to Hollywood, San Diego, and then back across the United States through the Grand Canyon, Kansas City, and back to New York. A months-long cavalcade across the United States. And he mentions that, he was getting a certain amount of money, that the British officials would be, his complaint was, they would pay me, but they never paid me very much. Because that's where the money is coming from, this. He doesn't have any great income, which is coming in. So suddenly he's, barely sort of keeping things together in New York, and now he's engaged on this months-long transcontinental trip, which did involve expenses. So the purposes for the whole trip seemed to be a combination of things, as usual. One part of it was the continuation of his spiritual journey. He starts out initially traveling alongside his current Scarlet Woman, his sort of girlfriend, and his equipment. Remember, he is the great beast 666. Baphomet, that's the names he's taken for himself, and therefore his consort is supposed to be Babylon, Babalon, the Scarlet Woman. So that's what his main squeeze was always termed. She was the Scarlet Woman, and this was a woman who was actually, he was traveling with her and her elderly husband. Banging her the whole time across the country, and supposedly the husband never caught on to this. I'm not sure, but that's what Crowley would do. He was going on a spiritual retreat. He also stops in Detroit, and that's where he gets his paper sack full of mescaline, pound or so, and so he's basically banging a Scarlet Woman, taking lots of mescaline, engaged in spiritual development, but also in observing things. And I think that's one of the main reasons, intelligence-wise, he's going to these different places, is so he can simply report upon what's happening there. So, he shows up, I don't want to go too much into this, he shows up in San Francisco just when a German spy ring is unraveling there and being prosecuted that involved German diplomats, the consul von Bopp, also a fellow by the name of von Brinken, who was a kind of vice consul in San Francisco. They end up arrested and prosecuted for violating neutrality. So it's always interesting, and I don't think coincidental that Crowley is in town while these things are going on. So it's all part of this trip. So he shows up on the 8th of November in Union Station in Los Angeles. And keep in mind, this is a very different L.A. and Hollywood then than it is now. The movie industry is well established, although this is still fairly early. This is 1914, but Hollywood has certainly become the main motion picture production locus in the U.S. at that time. There are lots of studios, but the Hollywood Hills, which are covered in houses today like lice, were largely still open. There's not much which is built there. You would find a much smaller, it would have been, the LA Basin, instead of being a giant, sprawling megalopolis of undifferentiated, boring architecture for the most part, would nevertheless be, and I do kind of like the place, but that's what it is, would be sort of downtown LA, the Hollywood studios to the north of that, clustering around the hills, and then lots of little smaller separate towns. And one of the things you wouldn't see if you were looking at it, the Hollywood sign or the Hollywood land sign isn't there. That would be missing. And that doesn't come along until 1923. So he shows up there. he doesn't. He describes. I'm going to paraphrase this. He describes Hollywood as a kind of collection of cocaine crazed sex maniacs and half baked semi occultists. So you have to wonder, who did he meet while he was there during the... I mean, who managed to make that negative of an impression? Well, maybe all he had to do was to walk around. But that's one of the things to keep in mind, is that this isn't even the Hollywood of the 20s and the 30s. This is the Hollywood of 1915, which was a much more smaller scale, even more sort of rustic environment that you'd have otherwise. One of the things he does mention is taking a hike through the crescent of hills to the north of downtown Los Angeles. What's he talking about? The Hollywood Hills. So Aleister Crowley, I don't know where his route took him, how long his hike was, but if you want to, you can imagine him traipsing through Laurel Canyon, where hippiedom would later have its musical source.
This is my second movie that we got to produce, which is, the first one is The Green Dragon.
Okay.
Called Ickyville. Second one is this, Aleister Crowley's, excellent adventure.
Excellent adventure in Hollywood. So I said that Crowley kept a diary, and in that he would often mention the people that he was going to meet. And here I'm going to have to pull up my notes because I have to remember what it is that I'm going to say here. And Crowley mentions that when he's in L.A., in Hollywood, walking around, he's going to meet someone. It's someone. He's got this noted down that he's going to meet someone, and that he actually stop this for a second so I can figure out. Okay, now I got it. I have to find the right piece of paper. All right, so when Crowley gets there, he has noted in his diary, in his own cryptic way, and it has been said by many, his diaries, while useful, can be very cryptic. There's a person he's supposed to contact. Why is he supposed to contact them? We don't know. And what's this person's name? That's the most important thing. Well, he doesn't give that either. Instead, what he gives are Greek initials. And those initials are basically Theta Mu Phi, and sort of THMP or TMP. And why does he do that? Well, one of the things that Crowley, among other things, is very interested in gematria, which is the magic of numbers. And there's Hebrew gematria and there's Greek gematria. But in Greek gematria, the letters of the Greek alphabet all have numerical equivalents. They each equal a particular number, and that number could be something like 9, or it could be 40, or it could be 500. So you can reduce these things down to a number, like 666. But what this looks like to me, and I've thought a lot about this, is what he's referring to someone by, is that what this looks like to me is a mystical motto. And when people would become initiates in esoteric or occult orders, like the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, or like Crowley's other more personal secret society, the AA, and we'll discuss in a minute what that may or may not stand for. So people, as a probationer, as an initiate, you would be asked to take a kind of a mystical name or a motto. And that was supposed to represent your aspiration. What was it in your pursuit of occult knowledge did you aspire to? And these would almost always be in Latin or in Greek. So early on, I think of the Golden Dawn. I think it was the Golden Dawn that when Crowley was initiated, his motto was Perdurabo, I will endure. And sometimes it was one word or two words or three words, but this would express your kind of aspiration. And that's what I'm 90% sure what he's referring to. He doesn't want to put this person's name down. That's interesting. He doesn't want to write out their name. But what he will do is to give their kind of magical or initiate initials, which then suggests to me that he knows who this person is and he knows their motto. And that's how he's referring them. So it's a motto, it's an initiate's motto in what organization? Now, Crowley at this point in 1915 is connected to a number of orders, but the two central ones in this case are the AA, which is something that he and a fellow by the name of Charles Russell formed in around 1906 and 1907. And that was meant to be, that was Crowley's initial vehicle to promote Thelema. So remember, in 1904, a few years earlier, he'd gotten this spiritual revelation. He'd written the Book of the Law, or he'd had the Book of the Law dictated to him, however you want to interpret this. And this was to be the new doctrine, the new sort of Bible, the gospel, Crowley's gospel that was to be promoted. And so the AA was really his restructuring of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. I don't want to get bogged down in too many paths, but there was a group that was the first real secret society that he had joined back in the late 1890s, in which then was collapsed soon after, largely thanks to him. But the other problem in it is that it sort of collapsed through its own kind of internal politics. And Crowley entered the organization and became involved with and personally exacerbated personal disputes within the organization. Groups just didn't get along. So the whole idea in the AA was that everybody studied individual. There was no group. There were no group meetings. It was a correspondence course in occultism that you basically took from Crowley and kind of paid for the lessons as you went along. Or the idea in this case is you used his doctrines, and then ideally each initiate would have a mentor. It would be a kind of one-on-one thing. But there were no groups, and therefore and that sort of avoided the whole problem with group dynamics. It also theoretically avoided the problem of any kind of rival to Crowley's authority emerging within an organization, which is what often happens there. You get a struggle for control. So the AA was a relatively small organization. I mean, it's never meant to be that large. It's quite selective in many ways. He had initiated people into it, and he would know them. So it's possible the person that he's going to see in Hollywood is an initiate in the AA. And, what exactly is that? Maybe a little more definite, because you'll run across it. And one of the things for me that confused me for a long time is what the difference was between the AA and the OTO, which is the other group we'll get. Because people talk about the OTO, which is an organization. It's a group with leaders, with lodges. The AA doesn't function that way. Well, first of all, what does that actually stand for? Nobody knows exactly. It's a secret. It's one of the secrets you have to find out. The organization was more properly termed the Great White Brotherhood. And that, by the way, is a kind of direct ripoff. It's a direct derivative from Madame Blavatsky's Theosophy, in which the Great White Brotherhood is this group of ascended masters who rule the world. He described it as a magical spiritual order. And what you're trying to do is it is one true invisible order. Initiates work alone under the guidance of a superior to avoid group dynamics. And one of the things you try to find, what are you after in all of this? Well, it's based in the law of Thelema, and you're trying to determine your one true will. Okay, figure out what that is. Contact your guardian angel. That's another part of it. Living by the law of Thelema. And a part of this, of course, you accepted the absolute authority of the Great Beast 666 and the Scarlet Woman.
Okay.
Crowley and whatever his current girlfriend was. And you accept Horus as the Lord of the new Eon, and then you go through a series of grades and initiations. So this person could have been an initiate in the AA. But then we come to the OTO, which was an order. Now, Crowley did not create the OTO. The Ordo Templi Orientis, or the Order of the Eastern Temples, or as it's often described, the Order of the Eastern Templars, was formed in Germany and Austria, again, some years, but about 10 years earlier, around 1905. And the fellow who then became the kind of dominant figure in it was Theodor Reuss. And it was Reuss who had initiated Crowley into the OTO around 1910 to 1912. So Crowley had been initiated in the OTO, and Reuss had made him the head of the order for the English-speaking world, at least for Britain, and in Crowley's view, in the whole sort of Anglophone world. So he was already kind of extending his role within the organization. So that's the group with which Crowley's name is most closely associated with today, and it still exists in different forms. There are factions within it. But it wasn't something that he created. So the AA was something that Crowley created. It never became particularly large. The OTO doesn't become large either, but it is an organization. It essentially, in many ways, to me, aspired to be, under Reuss, to become a kind of one-stop occult store, and taking in, controlling different sort of Masonic orders were involved in it. At one point, he termed it a Masonic academy. That was to be part. But another thing that was sort of absorbed into this were some, I think altogether, sort of like 18 separate small occult lodges or organizations were more or less bought up. You think of the OTO becomes like a corporation, and it's buying up smaller little companies to be a part of that, and in some cases amalgamating them, or in other cases dissolving them completely, and so or forming others. So the OTO simply was pretty much whatever it was you wanted to make it. It was whatever it digested in some ways. Crowley's later goal, of course, was to use the OTO as a larger outreach organization to advance Thelema. That's what he always wants to do. So when when Reuss dies in the early 20s, and Crowley assumes control of most but not all of what had been the OTO, that's what he then wants to turn it into being. This is now going to be his new vehicle, his new sort of public church, as opposed to the AA always remaining this kind of more secret organization. So Crowley had been initiated into the OTO, into the German OTO. And I might add here that Theodor Reuss was also a German intelligence officer, and an occultist. What a surprise to find those two together. So the other possibility is that this person, this Theta Mu Phi in Hollywood, was an OTO initiate. Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably more likely. That is, this person and Crowley were both initiates within that organization. So, and I'll explain a little bit why I think that would be the case. So Crowley, before he gets down to Hollywood, got to back up a little bit, stopped off in Vancouver, specifically in North Vancouver, and he was there for a few days. He arrived there using a pseudonym. Okay, everyone there was only to refer to him as Brother Clifford.
Why?
Yeah. There are different theories about that. One idea which has been suggested is that what he was being all secret squirrel about in this trip was his relationship with Mrs. Foster what her name was, and her husband. So he was trying to cover up the fact that he was basically, sleeping with this married woman while traveling with her cross country. I don't really buy. I don't think that would have bothered him much one way or the other. Okay. He was carrying on an affair with her pretty much under the nose of her husband, who either wasn't aware of it or didn't care. I don't think that was, Crowley wasn't going to try to cover that up. I don't think he cared. Again, he's there. I think for some reason he didn't want it known, maybe to Canadian immigration, that he was there under his name. It was for some reason to keep that quiet. But so he meets now. Why does he go there? Why does he spend time there? Well, this is where, at that point in time, I think there actually was an English-speaking lodge of the OTO. There's another one in London, so Crowley had sort of started one there. But now there's one which has appeared in North Vancouver, which is seemingly a kind of odd place for it to be. But there it is. And so there's a small group of faithful followers. He comes to see them, to encourage them, tell them how to have, swing parties. And now that's basically true. Why do I argue that?
Sex magic?
Well, sex magic is a part of this. And Crowley is always a proponent of that. And that is basically using sexual congress of one form or another to generate energy for ritual purposes.
Yeah, which is Abramovich's, right? Isn't that supposed to be a Thelema or Thelema ritual with the blood and the semen? And I have it in the intro.
Yes, well, that becomes a cakes of light become the kind of sacramental bread in the Church of Thelema. Okay. And those are things that include, some wheat and sugar and the rest of that, but also sperm and menstrual blood.
Yeah.
So usually, I always find that people will tend to waffle. Well, sometimes they have them, sometimes they don't. I don't know. Why would you just put it in sometimes?
It's like grape juice versus wine. Yeah.
So sex magic was a part of it. One thing that Crowley never liked, and this is a consistent thing all the way through later the lodge that will establish itself in Hollywood, is that he hated it when the OTO was described as a love cult. And he didn't like the idea that people were just joining this because it was becoming kind of a swingers club. And that's one of the things that would later make it popular. These people had very liberal attitudes towards sex, and in 1935, not a lot of places did.
Yeah, wasn't the free love movement kind of getting started around this time period too in the United States?
Well, free love had been around for years.
But there was,
but it was widely, free love was widely connected. Well, it was connected with weirdos. That's what it was getting, to anarchists.
Yeah, I was going to say.
So Emma Goldman was an anarchist and a proponent of free love.
Right. Yeah, she was against marriage.
Alexandra Kollontai was a Bolshevik and a proponent. So it was often connected to political radicalism because it often was. But he didn't like it because he thought it was, it wasn't dignified. Thelema was not a love cult.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about a bunch of people getting together and getting high and getting their rocks off. It wasn't just a swingers club. It really isn't. It's more than that.
Yeah. I promise.
Yet, on the other hand, he seems to have encouraged it. So by one description, he's there, one of the things that there were differing attitudes in the Vancouver Lodge, which, by the way, was called Agape Love, Spiritual Love Lodge number 1. So this is where the original Agape Lodge, so maybe people wouldn't think it was a love cult if you didn't call the lodge Love Lodge. I know it's spiritual love. It's not sexual love. Well, what's the newspaper readers might not make the distinction between those two things. So within the lodge, one of the things that often seemed to have been the case is that the men were more interested in this than necessarily their wives or girlfriends might have been. And so this created dissension. There were some people who were, You know, there were some people who wanted to swing and there were others who didn't. I mean, all for spiritual enlightenment purposes, of course. But Crowley at one point told them, well, this is how you get things going. Okay, so you got to bump people here. So person A and person B basically start having sex with person C in front of everyone. And then persons D and E will start doing something, and then G, H, and I, I'm losing track. But then the other three will be watching this, and they'll get excited, and then they'll go over to a corner and start getting it on. All right, that was the advice he, in other words, have somebody start having sex in front of everyone else, and that will supposedly turn them on, and then you'll get, is that an origin? An orgy? Excuse me. And if you heard a weird noise in the background, that was my phone that
I was wondering what that was.
I did not remove from the room for some reason. We may get around to that. Or just,
we have many phones.
It'll make noises every now and then. There it comes again. So, there was the whole, the whole sex magic love cult thing was a matter of constant controversy, but it's always kind of there. And I think much to Crowley's chagrin, it seems to me, that often tended to be one of the main things that people would show up for. So later on in the 30s, with the new Agape Lodge 2 that would then later be founded in Hollywood, the head of that would boast, we had 150 people show up for social night because they would give parties, which in some cases seem to have turned in for some people. It seems to become a kind of meat market type of thing where people, that they're going to be, well, it's a love cult, so I'm going to go to this social gathering at a love cult and maybe get lucky. And so those 150 people somehow didn't turn into 150 Thelemites. Relatively few people joined the organization. They were just showing up for the hors d'oeuvres and the chance of getting laid. So Crowley was, he sort of helped them out, but there are a couple of people there that he meets that are important to how this Hollywood story evolves. One of the members of the original Agape Lodge in Vancouver was an Englishman who had come over to Canada by the name of Wilfrid Talbot Smith. Now, he's later going to become the head of the OTO in L.A., in Hollywood, and then later in Pasadena.
Yeah.
But he is just a kind of regular follower, and it's even later a matter of debate as to whether or not he and Crowley, or Brother Clifford, ever actually meet during the visit. Smith would later insist that he had actually talked to Crowley for at least 20 minutes, maybe a half an hour. Crowley later disclaimed, I don't remember you at all. I don't even remember you. I don't know who you were. You were nobody. But Crowley could be dismissive in that way. But it was a very brief meeting. So the two of them ever actually met in their entire lives for 20 minutes to a half an hour. Crowley then leaves, goes on, eventually finds his way down to L.A. And now the other person in the Vancouver Lodge that might play into this was another member of the lodge by the name of Horace Sheridan Bickers. I think he had a wife named Betty. They all seem to have a wife named Betty for some reason. Very popular woman's name at that time. So Horace Sheridan Bickers is interesting. He's again British, an initiate into the OTO. And then later, he goes to Hollywood and briefly becomes a publicist and screenwriter. Now, if you go into IMDb and you look for H. Sheridan Bickers, he didn't have much of a career there. But he does show up, but not until after Crowley goes through. Horace Sheridan Bickers does not travel with Crowley to Hollywood. He doesn't precede him there. He can't possibly be the person that Crowley is going to see. So who could that be? Well, there's a particular character that will play a role years later in Crowley's life. So getting in our time machine and skipping forward, as I like to do, if we go to Paris in 1928 and 1929, that is more than a decade down the road. Crowley is again looking to redeem his reputation. He's trying to clean up his public image. He's living in France at the time, just about to get kicked out of the country. And in order to clean up his image, what do you need? Well, you need a press agent. You need a PR. You need someone who's going to go out and sell a better version of yourself to the press.
What does he have to clean up if he's trying to cultivate this image of being the great beast? Just trying to be more of a great beast? Or?
Well, the thing that's really sticking to him is being a traitor and the wickedest man in the world.
I thought he liked the wickedest.
A child-killing Satanist. Things like that.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Is that a legitimate view? I don't think it was. He could argue, no, you're misunderstanding these type of things. Right. Well, that's
didn't he like the most wicked man in the world stuff though?
Well, he thought it was cool for a while. I mean, somebody's just calling me the wickedest person in the world. I mean, that's something,
right?
I get to be something. And if you want to shock, I mean, there was an element of Crowley that liked to shock standard morals and induce pearl clutching. I think he really liked the idea of inducing pearl clutching, and that would work. But then what you find out is that it makes it impossible for you to go home. That's why he's living in France for 10 years. He can't go back and live in England because the minute he comes back there, the British press, the British tabloid press that will eat anyone alive, get a hold of that, and then they start running all of these articles about how this guy was a traitor during the war and he ought to be hanged and he's a renegade and and he's a devil-worshipping black magician. And that just meant that you couldn't. And that sort of goes, I mean, Crowley embraced that. But keep in mind, what he wants to be in some ways is the kind of New Age Jesus.
Okay. All right.
Or a prophet. He wants to be some kind of prophet of this new religion. And he thinks that Thelema represents a kind of new, more modern, streamlined, Art Deco.
Art Deco.
No, it's sort of a kind of new age, new morality, which is coming. Remember, this is why he objects to the OTO being called a love cult or a sex club.
Okay.
Because, it's more than that.
Yeah.
You have to take this stuff seriously. And what he realized is that so long as you're seen as the wickedest man in the world and some kind of evil magician, no one is ever really going to take you seriously. Okay. They will never look beyond that. So the reputation that once seemed cool was now a kind of obstacle, and it kept him from living in England. And so he hires a fellow to be his press agent, who was a Franco-German American journalist, mostly for the Hearst syndicate, and with the interesting name of Carl, or sometimes Charles, de Vidal Hunt. So Carl de Vidal Hunt. So Devidel, and then see this. Sometimes his first name is Carl, sometimes it's Charles. Sometimes Hunt is spelled the German way, Hunt, Hundt. Put that into there to get the Hunt. Mm-hmm. Okay. As opposed to just good old American Hunt. Okay, so you just says Hunt. So and then sometimes you'll go by Charles Vidal or some kind of Carl Hunt. So why does he keep changing his name? Because he's involved in questionable activities. Okay, like blackmail and other things. So he's a very kind of colorful figure. We'll come back to what he was doing earlier on. But this is the guy that in late 20s Paris, Crowley hires as his press agent. And that could have been just because de Vidal had been a press agent for... He'd been a press agent semi-successfully for a claimant to the Spanish throne, Don Louis of Bourbon, one of the kind of fringe claimants to the Spanish throne, who'd been arrested for drug smuggling, among other things, and had a generally bad reputation and was expelled from France. And so I think Crowley partly thought that if de Vidal could clean up this guy's reputation, or try to, he could do mine. But The interesting thing is that I think, and this is where the speculation comes in, this is where putting the pieces together, that Crowley in the late 20s in Paris engaged Carl de Vidal Hunt to be his press agent because they already had some acquaintance. And I think that acquaintance takes us back to Hollywood in 1915. So, a little more about Carl or Charles de Vidal Hunt or Hunt. He was, the curious thing, his father was German, who for some reason moved to France in the late 19th century. I don't know, maybe that happened a lot. I suspect maybe his father, who was originally Wilhelm Hunt, but then changed his name to Guillaume Hunt, might have been a kind of political refugee from political turmoil in Germany. You know, maybe he was part of the 1848 exodus that left there. Anyway, Hunt was born around 1870. He was born in Paris to a German father and a French mother. So did that make him German or French? Well, he could pretend to be either one. He later ends up, he speaks both of those languages along with English. And in the 1880s, he immigrates to Chicago, where he becomes involved in German-American politics, and also part of a German-American sort of fraternal organization, and he becomes a reporter for the Chicago Tribune. He becomes connected to the Hearst press pretty early on. And around 1900, he becomes connected. He gets very bad publicity in Chicago because his name is connected to a blackmail plot. And basically, a young woman brings a kind of what we would call today a Me Too lawsuit against a wealthy Chicagoan. And I don't know, nobody knows exactly what was going on there, but that was later reduced as she was trying to, blackmail him. And Hunt, as we'll call him, was her representative. He was the guy going around kind of promoting her story. And this all blows up. It creates a kind of, well, I say more than a kerfuffle. It creates a wave of anxiety and consternation among the Chicago elite. And the whole thing is pretty much, as one might expect, glossed over. It's all this, the charges are retracted. Nobody seems to go to jail for anything, but Hunt is now seen as the villain, the guy who put her up to this and was threatening wealthy, important people in Chicago. So he leaves Chicago, and he then heads about 1906 to L.A., and there throws himself into, he becomes connected to a number of things, and he seems to show up with a certain amount of money, because he seems to get rich quite fast. So by 1914 or 1915, by the time that Crowley would show up, Hunt is now well established in the movie industry. And he apparently had a few acting roles, but mostly as a press agent. But he plays influential roles. He's the general secretary of the Photo Players Club, which is a kind of exclusive club for people within the industry itself. Directors, the more important actors, other executives would be a part of it. And he manages their social events. But then he's also, at the same time, the sort of entertainment supervisor or head of all of the public outreach and entertainment for the LA Athletic Club. Now, I'd run across that before. LA Athletic Club, what could possibly go? Well, the LA Athletic Club at the time was a private men's club. It advertised its membership as being doctors, lawyers, capitalists, and the stars of the film industry, important actors and directors. So that's how these people sort of mixed together. So you got Hollywood mixing together with, this is like a James Ellroy novel, which is coming. And so these guys get together. You got to call it rich men in Hollywood. Okay, this is a rich guys club.
I've heard the name before, and that's why.
Well, here's the interesting thing that they do. And this is one of the things where I found a whole sort of press report on Vidal putting together. They have summer retreats. So in the summer, they all go off and have like a boys' club somewhere, not in a redwood grove in Northern California.
Yeah.
So this is what it's getting. They behave and act
very similar.
like the LA version of the Bohemian Club.
Yeah.
But so what's describing is that what are they going to do? Well, they're kind of fascinated with the 49ers. And I also suspect a crossover with E. Clampus Vitus. I think that may play a role in this. So he's set up this whole thing for them that they're going to go out somewhere near the coast, near the beach, and they're going to build like this little fake Western village, and everybody will play a character. So he plays like a bad guy, and then other people are playing. There's a guy who plays a judge, and that's played by the L. Frank Baum, the author of Wizard of Oz. So remember, Baum was a popular writer, and he lived in Hollywood, and he was a member of the L.A. Athletic Club.
Okay,
and that you can play on your own. You can research on your own all the different occult theories about, the theories rather about occult imagery and influence in the Wizard of Oz. Was L. Frank Baum a Rosicrucian? Was he well connected to theosophy and spiritualism? You bet he was. Mostly through his mother-in-law. Okay, he was a self-described witch. But anyway. His mother-in-law, who's very influential as a witch, and who are the main characters in the Wizard of Oz?
Well,
there we go.
I'd always heard, and I forgot what history professor put it out there in the 60s or 70s. It's all populism. And political influence. So L. Frank Baum plays a judge. So all of these rich guys are going out and they're going to pretend to be cowboys, basically, and miners, and then they're going to spend 2 weeks out near the beach. Now, my question is, when do the girls show up? Because I'm pretty sure, they're not going to make this one big stag party. That wouldn't be the real Wild West town, would it? Sure.
Okay. So, they're going, and this is the same, it's just like Bohemian Grove near Pismo, which is where I think they're going. But it's similar. And this was in some ways kind of interesting to figure out that I think it is just kind of an imitation or a copying, or maybe this is the way of organizing these elite men's clubs. But this one we're closely connected to Hollywood, de Vidal. And the other thing they're going to do is they're actually going to pretend this is a movie. So they're going to film the whole thing. And, if they were doing this on an island in the Caribbean, one could get really Epstein about it. But this is always something that should raise your hackles of suspicion. Okay, it doesn't prove anything.
Rich men with cameras.
When a lot of rich guys with cameras go off in private and to perform what they call hijinks. And there's actually a description of these gatherings that, what's the whole spirit of the gathering? And this is in a newspaper, I think in the LA Times. And David All Hunt says that, the whole spirit of this is joy and pleasure unfettered and uninterrupted.
It's like a bachelor party? Like I'm not...
Yeah. Well, but you think about it, that's kind of almost do what thou wilt.
Oh,
there's something sort of Crowleyan in that, in a way. But I mean, the spirit of this place was, here again, we seem to be running into a sex party. But nevertheless, every time you turn around, there's an orgy. That we're talking about. We're talking about Hollywood. So the main thing about Carl or Charles, Davidal, Hunt or Hunt, is that by 1915, he is very entrenched and influential in the film community. He knows lots of people therein. He has a number of connections. He has a house in Montecito, which is this still glossy suburb of Santa Barbara, where I once lived, and that's a place where movie stars would go. And how he got all of this wealth, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, having a house in Montecito wasn't cheap in 1915, and it's certainly not cheap today. Oh, by the way, he also becomes connected to the Boy Scouts. So a little earlier, on 1912 or 1913, he's connected to the American Boy Scouts in Los Angeles. Now, here's another little interesting. Didn't you know that there were 2 Boy Scout organizations at that time? So there's that. Baden-Powell starts the whole scouting movement in Britain. And then you've got the Boy Scouts of America, which I had heard of, but that's not the same. And I would just assume initially that if I saw a press reference to the American Boy Scouts, they're just talking about the Boy Scouts of America. But no, there were 2 different groups. And eventually, the Boy Scouts of America emerges. It survives. The American Boy Scouts do not. They pretty much fade away or amalgamate. So what was the difference between them? The main difference was that the Boy Scouts of America did not include military training as part of scouting. Okay, there were no guns in scouting. And that was denounced by some people as being pacifist. It was a pacifist organization. So the American Boy Scouts, which, by the way, were subsidized by William Randolph Hearst, same guy that Hunt is connected to, they were all for military training. In fact, they were organized into brigades. So there was so he's somehow connected with this Hearst-backed militant scouting organization. But he also has another kind of interesting background. I need to kind of show who this guy was. So remember, he fled Chicago because his name was involved in some kind of high society blackmail scheme. And then he goes all the way sort of across the country. And that's where the de Vidal creeps into his name. So remember, that's not what his birth name is. Charles Adolph Hunt, with the D. It gets to the States again. Charles becomes Charles, or it becomes Carl. I mean, it's sort of when he's hanging around Germans, he's Carl. Okay. When he's hanging around non-Germans, it becomes Charles. So the story eventually goes that around 1906, he ends up in L.A. He gets another job with a Hearst paper there, but now he's calling himself Charles de Vidal. I'm not even sure where that comes from. And that's to disguise what he was before. And then someone recognizes him and go, "Hey, aren't you that guy who was involved in this blackmail plot in Chicago?" And he goes, "Okay, you got me." But then he combines the names together. And one explanation I heard is that, well, the de Vidal was the name of his aristocratic California wife. So he came to California and he found someone who was the descendant of the original Spanish land grant owners. Zorro, a kind of Zorro princess he married. But I find no record of that. There's no public record of it. There was also a claim later on that this first wife tragically died young of consumption, of tuberculosis.
Okay.
Now that may be true. I can't find any actual documentary evidence. Her name is never mentioned anywhere. By about 1914, he marries another woman in L.A., but she is not Duval. She's French, actually, Franco-American. Her father's rich, which maybe is where some of the money comes from. But what happens is that in 1912, he leaves L.A. and he goes to Germany, where he, of course, becomes Karl Hunt. And then he connects himself to this medical doctor by the name of Dr. Friedmann. Dr. Friedmann. And Dr. Friedmann claims to have developed a vaccine for tuberculosis. Now, at that time, tuberculosis consumption was one of the major public health threats. It was rampant. And therefore anything that could produce a vaccine for it. And he claimed that he had developed a vaccine from sea turtles. This was called the turtle cure. I was first puzzled by turtle. I don't know. Apparently, sea turtles get tuberculosis in some way, or they get some version of tuberculosis that he thought he had developed from sea turtles. He had developed this vaccine, and of course he wanted to publicize it. And newspaper man, PR man, Carl Hunt then becomes his publicist. And so he plants, fantastic stories of cures, near miraculous cures in the press across Germany. And this leads thousands, if not tens of thousands of people to want this cure. Because again, this was a very common, it's a death sentence.
Yeah, right. And
so people are desperate for this. And Friedmann, his idea may have had some promise to it, but it didn't, the existing medical establishment, them, they were not going to go for this. They were going to insist on clinical trials to prove it. They thought this was untried, dangerous, or it was fake. But the other hand was that people kept wanting these cures, and sometimes it was multiple treatments. And then Friedmann turned around and just left Germany and all of those people and went over to America to try to sell it there. So what he's actually trying to do is to sell the patent for this cure. And he wants a lot of money for it. He wants more than $1 million in 1950. And he finds some, and again, in America, there are even more people who are desperate for a cure of consumption. There's I think a Chicago millionaire is willing to buy this. And the American medical establishment is no more pleased about this. Vidal again becomes his chief spokesman. They set up a clinic in New York. They are besieged by desperate people who want this cure. Friedmann again engages in various negotiations to sell it. I think at one point he actually does, and then turns around and goes back to Germany, leaving everyone in the lurch. Now, somehow or another, Vidal Hunt, as we'll call him, emerges out of this seemingly with a lot of money, because that's when he shows up back in L.A., gets into the movie business in a large way, marries a rich girl, gets a house in Montecito. So this, again, was one of those things that kind of clouded his reputation, because first there was the whole potential, alleged blackmail plot in Chicago. Then there is this whole connection to either the misunderstood, extremely inept, or crooked Dr. Friedmann and his tuberculosis cure around 1913. But then he goes on to, now he's kind of a big cheese in the whole kind of entertainment realm. So he's an important person in Hollywood. And that's the person I think that Crowley is going to see. I think he's going to see Carl Vidal Hunt. And that's also possibly why he would disguise his name, because that name might raise questions. And that would be why more than a dozen years later, he would re-engage Hunt to be his PR man, to be his press agent. So what were they going to talk about? Here again, I would suspect that this had something to do with Crowley's observational espionage. I think in many ways what he was doing. And I know that other people, that the British intelligence office in New York would do that. They would simply, there was a British playwright who was going to go on a cross-U.S. tour, but was essentially asked by Sir William Wiseman, which was the head of what was then MI6, when you go to these different towns, gauge the attitude of the, you're going to be going, and most of the people are going to show up at your plays or receptions with members of the local elite. We're interested in their opinion. We're not interested in the opinion of Joe Schmo. We're interested in the opinion of the doctors, lawyers, the important people, the opinion makers, the influencers within these cities, and see what their attitude about the war is. And that's all he would do. He would simply talk to people at parties, ask them their attitude about the war, and then write back to Wiseman about what that attitude seemed to be, and the attitude seemed to be in these different cities. And I think that's pretty much the type of thing that Crowley was doing. He was just sort of getting the lay of the land. And one of the things about Hollywood and its emerging role as the head of the movie industry is that film influenced public opinion. And therefore, what was the opinion about the war in neutral America in the movie-making capital? And Hunt, being well connected to producers and the artists involved, could provide some information on that. The other thing, though, is he's also connected to the German apparatus in California. So Hunt would at various times style himself as either a Frenchman or a German, but he was particularly friendly with a German diplomat, one of those who had been implicated in the neutrality violations, a fellow by the name of Wilhelm von Brinken. And Wilhelm von Brinken was, I think, a vice consul in San Francisco. What he was implicated in was the passing of money to... The whole thing was that the Germans had been supplying money to Indian nationalists. Oh. You know, what in the press at the time were called Hindu seditionists, in order to buy guns...
To fund the rebellion.
To put on a ship to send to India to start a rebellion.
Yeah.
And so the Germans were, not too surprisingly, willing to fund that, but because it was then decided that that violated American neutrality laws, they were, well, either expelled or arrested. So von Brinken actually is arrested. He takes the fall for the whole thing. But he and Vidal Hunt know each other, socially, even at that time. And the other interesting thing is that once he gets out of prison, once the war is over, he's released, I think about 1919. And then von Brinken, where does he go? He goes to Hollywood. And he changes his name to William Beckwith, and he becomes an actor.
Okay.
Often playing German officers, strangely enough. Okay, we need a Prussian with a monocle. I've got one of those.
I got a guy.
Okay. And so he and Vidal Hunt are also sort of socially active at that point. So I'm not quite sure how all of this fits together. I mean, it's one of these things that maybe it was just that, maybe the whole connection between Vidal Hunt and von Brinken / Beckwith was just purely personal and social. But given what else was going on, the neutrality issues, the other thing that the San Francisco consulate was involved in was anti-Allied sabotage, that is blowing up British munition ships in Oakland, which they did have a hand in, that maybe Hunt knew more about that. Maybe in some way Hunt was connected to this. Now, see, the whole thing, remember, is that while Crowley is traveling secretly as a British intelligence operative, outwardly he's what? A pro-German propagandist. He's still on the payroll of the fatherland. He's still in tight with people like George Sylvester Viereck and the German propaganda cabinet in New York. So he can also tell them... So it's like the Germans will give him introductions to other Germans in these cities, which he can then use that information to report back to Guy Gaunt and British naval intelligence. That's the art of being a double agent. So it could have that aspect in it too, but in some way Crowley thought it necessary to disguise that person's name. But what it would also indicate, if I'm right about the fact that these Greek letters represent the aspirational, magical motto of a secret society initiate, putting the pieces together, I think that Vidal Hunt at some point had been initiated into the OTO when he was in Germany. And that's what Crowley knew, and that Royce, who was the head of the OTO and probably would have initiated him the same as he did Crowley, would have let him know that. So there are a whole number of interesting things that seem to come together at this point. What else? So there's that kind of connection that then later will be reestablished between Crowley and David L. Hunt in the late 30s. And it could also suggest that through David L. Hunt, if he was indeed an OTO initiate, that there was some influence or presence of that organization, not the organization that Crowley would later control exactly, before Crowley itself and early on in Hollywood. So if I'm right about David O. Hunt and that he was an initiate into the German OTO, that means the organization itself had a presence there early on that predates Crowley himself. So, of course, what has happened in the intervening years is that in the early 20s, Royce died. Crowley sort of maneuvered control of the OTO as a new vehicle for the promotion of Thelema. He was always attempting to do this. Within these various esoteric groups, it's like corporate structure. They're always trying to gobble each other up in many ways. And Crowley was, one of the things that he was looking for, even in the 30s, was a better vehicle to advance the ideas of Thelema. Because as we'll see, the OTO in Hollywood did not appear to be going anywhere. Okay, it wasn't making any particular inroads. And one of the things that he dreamed of doing, and it was pretty much a pipe dream, was taking over the Rosicrucian organization centered in San Jose, California. And that's where you had, AMORC, the ancient mystical order of the Rosy Cross, the 10th thing that used to advertise in the back of comic books and in science fiction magazines. And then that had been turned into a fairly large mail order occult empire. And it was successful enough that Crowley thought that if he could get control of it, if he could wrest control of this organization, that it would be a more useful vehicle in that case. Plus, it could also bring in a lot more money, which he thought was necessary. And his whole basis for doing this, the way that he thought he might be able to do it, is that the head of the... Stop here for a minute, because I got to get this guy's name, which I cannot remember. The head of AMORC. I can only remember his pseudonym, Wisher Splenny Survey. So, what Crowley sought to do, and an legally questionable idea, was that the American head of AMORC, which was the biggest at that time Rosicrucian organization, was Harvey Spencer Lewis. And Harvey Spencer Lewis claimed that he had been initiated by French adepts, French Rosicrucians back in the early 20th century. Probably a BS story, but one never knows. But what Harvey Spencer Lewis did was that he took Rosicrucianism and he turned it into a mail order religion. Where you could send off for, you want to learn the secrets of the universe? You want to be able to levitate? You wanted to make yourself invisible? Do you want to know the mysteries of life and death? Well, you can. Just for $1 a lesson, you can send. And he was making the money, and he built the whole Rosicrucian Center and their fake Egyptian museum in San Jose. It was a fairly thriving. So Crowley looked at that, and he compared it to the Agape Lodge in Hollywood that would come into being, and decided that it would be much better to take control of Lewis's organization. And his justification for doing that, or his argument for doing it, was that Lewis had at some point been also initiated by Theodore Royce, the same guy who had initiated Crowley into the German OTO. And that by that, the argument basically was that Harvey Spencer Lewis only exercised his authority over the ancient mystical order of the Rosy Cross because of the authorization of Royce, who was also head of the OTO, which made Royce Lewis's superior, his master. And now that Crowley had taken control of the OTO, or most of it. He was actually the head of this, so everything that Lewis had was his. So you have to give me AMORC. You have to give me all of this stuff. It wasn't going to work. But that was in some ways, I think, how desperate, if that's the word for it, that Crowley was at that point in time. So I think there's that kind of connection. See, one of the things which has intrigued me is that the organization that would eventually arise, the clearly Crowleyite, Thelemite OTO that would later emerge in Hollywood, the one that rocket scientist Jack Parsons would then briefly become the head of in the 1940s. Well, how did that get started? So how does that appear? How does the Agape Lodge that had first been formed in Vancouver, British Columbia, somehow end up on Winona Boulevard in Hollywood? Well, that takes us back to this guy that said that he met Crowley for 20 minutes or maybe a half an hour back in 1915, Wilfrid Talbot Smith. So he was born in England, has kind of an interesting upbringing. He was the... Well, you ever wonder what becomes of someone who's the son of a parlor maid impregnated by one of the sons of a wealthy household? That's him. All right, so he was there was a wealthy British family. One of their teenage sons knocked up one of the serving girls. She gave birth to a bastard who was kind of part of the family, but really wasn't, so they didn't give him their name, and he just pretended to be somebody's fringe nephew. Went to horrible public schools where he was abused in innumerable ways. So he suffered through that. And then the other thing that probably had more to do with influencing Wilfrid Talbot's life and perhaps future trajectory was that he had a giant penis. Or as it was put later, he was hung like a horse.
Wait. How do... Is this his own, attestation? How do we know this? Is this...
People saw it and they were awed. Even Crowley asked to see it. So
this episode took a weird turn.
Well,
no.
Now I bring that in because that type of thing apparently influences people's lives. I'm speaking from...
Yeah. Oh well.
I mean, it does weird things because it's just,
Oh yeah, no,
and it shaped his whole. I think it made him very conscious of
his libidinal
It was
life.
sort of this. It was a blessing and a curse,
sure,
type of thing. And either the women he would meet were oddly attracted to him, or they would run away in horror.
Well, it's like having red hair. It's like, I've thought, should I be a clown many times?
You have just said that having red hair is the same as having a giant penis.
Well, it's a physical. It's a physical thing that you are given at birth. But you said it, not me.
I just bring it because I think that has a lot. That's true. That has a lot to do with shaping his. Why this guy would end up. Why would this guy possibly end up as part of a mystical society? Kind of sex cult in Hollywood.
Right.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Giant penis. We laugh, but it wasn't funny to him. So that was Wilfrid Talbot Smith. So he had very complicated domestic life. But again, long after 1915 in Crowley's little brief 2-3 day visit there, he, around 1922, leaves British Columbia, where the old Agape Lodge had folded. Everybody, the orgies apparently didn't work. Everybody got tired, and it withered away. Mm-hmm. And so he drifted down to Hollywood. He gets a job. Now, is he connected with the movie industry? Never. What is he? He's an accountant for the Southern California Gas Company.
Okay.
The gas company. So he goes to an office every day and just keeps track of gas bills.
I can't hate the man for...
Okay.
I worked for the Department of Transportation.
So he does not have, now he will then become, so he's still interested in Thelema. He's still really devoted to Crowley's ideas. And there were not a lot of people, but there were people who would embrace the law of Thelema. They believed that Crowley was a true guru. He was a true, he was a true prophet. And they were devoted to him. And Smith was a case of, it took years of Crowley just treating him like shit, just abusing someone who was a faithful follower. And this to me is the truly unpleasant side of Crowley. Okay, it's not all the child sacrifice, no, it's stuff, all of that, which didn't happen, pretty sure. But it's just the way that he could be a extremely abusive and manipulative individual. Some might say, what a surprise. And so what happened was that during the 20s, eventually, Smith made acquaintance of other people. You would find people who knew about Crowley and Crowleyana. There was a kind of small fan base, if nothing else, but there was no organization. And among those people one of them was an actress in Hollywood, a fairly veteran character actress who did, I think she actually played the Mary Pickford's mother in Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm. And her name is Jane Wolfe. You can look her up on IMDb. And Jane Wolfe, came out to Hollywood early. She was a woman, a character actress, and that she showed up playing different characters in lots of different films, but had a fairly extensive career that even continued on into the 30s. So she was a legitimate connection between what would become the OTO and Crowley and Hollywood later in the 1930s. But she's not an influential person in any particular way. She did know people. She's also one of the few people to which no real scandal is ever connected. Jane Wolfe seems to have been a fairly competent actress, and nobody had much of anything bad to say about her, but she was a follower of Aleister Crowley. So if you're ever watching, an old version of Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm, the woman who's playing the ingenue's mother, possibly her aunt, is a follower of Aleister Crowley. And, Jane Wolfe had gone off to that benighted Abbey of Thelema in Sicily in the early 20s. Huh. She'd spent much of the 20s in Europe living in poverty and degradation as well. After Crowley got kicked out of Sicily, she was one of the faithful that hung on there and tried to keep things going, and were reduced to, eating bad pasta or whatever else they could find, in Sicily at that point. She had suffered for her devotion to Crowley, and then she eventually, so in the late 20s, she leaves Europe, she comes back to Hollywood, resumes some acting. Another member of this relatively small group that would emerge was another woman with some connections to Hollywood. She was a voice and drama teacher by the name of Regina Call. Okay. Originally from Texas, German. And so she does things like teach acting and voice classes at LA City College. So she knows people who are in the movie business, but she's not influential in any particular way. And another guy who will become connected to this is a guy by the name of Roy Leffingwell. Roy Leffingwell was a local broadcaster, a local sort of DJ. I think for years he was known as the voice of the Rose Parade.
Oh, really?
He was the fellow from the Pasadena radio who would do the announcing. So you're listening to a guy announcing the Rose Parade. He's a follower of Aleister Crowley. They're everywhere. So Leffingwell was a, L.A. area noted radio personality. You've got a drama and voice coach at L.A. City College teacher. You've got an actress, a character actress who works intermittently. But that's about it in terms of any actual longtime associates of the OTO in Hollywood who had any real connection to the industry. That's about all that you can see. So around 1928, 1929, the same time that in France, Crowley is hiring former Hollywood publicist Carl de Vidal Hunt to be his press representative, Smith and Call and Leffingwell and Jane Wolfe all sort of come together in this group, and out of that will eventually emerge, about 1934 and 1935, a recreation of an actual functioning lodge of the OTO, and it's renamed the Agape Lodge.
This is Agape 2.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's kind of a restarting of, well, they have to get into, some argue because, one argument was that because it's just the original Agape Lodge that is now just being reformed here, it's still Agape number 1.
But didn't they call it Agape 2 or something? I thought that,
some did.
I thought we talked
some
about
didn't.
this before. Yeah.
It's the same. They're just using the same name. So it's
Okay.
just, so the Agape Lodge is reformed there. And so by the mid 30s, they've kind of got, 34, I think 35 is when the Agape Lodge is formally initiated.
Okay.
And Crowley, of course, and Smith is in constant correspondence with Crowley. Okay, if they'd had email, they would have been doing that, but they're sort of constantly writing. So Crowley is always aware of what's going on. He's very interested in this. He thinks the fact that there is now a foothold in Hollywood could be important for the various things that we've mentioned. This, Hollywood has become even more influential all around the world. And you're right there in Hollywood. And if you can recruit producers and directors and actors and get them all to promote the ideas of Thelema, this is what Crowley dreamed of happening. Mm-hmm. But there's no evidence that anything like that actually happened. So they get the lodge going, and they have things called Crowley Nights. They'll have parties, and people will come and they'll look around. You can attend, and so the centerpiece of Crowley's OTO, the central ritual, is the Gnostic Mass. And this was performed initially, so the first headquarters of this was at 1746 Winona Boulevard. And they had a large attic, and this is where they built their sort of temple. And this is where, initiates and other sort of interested guests, you could come as a guest and you could watch the Gnostic Mass unfold. And, what is, in some ways, what's the Gnostic Mass?
So this is like the Satanic Mass where they're taking the Christian Mass, but they're putting their own Gnostic spin on it.
Not really. It's the Gnostic Mass is pretty much Crowley's invention. I'm sure it's modified from something else. And first of all, you've got this term Gnostic, which, remember, does not actually define any specific religious creed. You can have Gnostics of all kinds of variety. The Gnosticism, the basic difference is that Gnosticism believes in salvation through knowledge. So therefore, the idea of the initiation into an organization through which you would progressively learn the secrets of the universe, so to speak, in which you would acquire spiritual knowledge and therefore ultimate liberation and salvation through the knowledge you acquired, not, as the church taught, through faith.
Tell me this, then what am I thinking of? I thought Gnosticism was always bound up with like the Cathar type, like there's a demiurge, this world is false, so on and so forth. But not necessarily. It's just more.
Doesn't have to. I mean, Gnosis, it comes to the word gnosis,
right,
which means knowledge. So the basic question is, how do you achieve salvation? Do you achieve it through faith? Do you just believe? Do you blindly believe in certain things, and do you follow ritual practices? I mean, here again, an example would be the Roman Catholic Mass. Mm-hmm. The church itself does not attempt to explain what goes on there. It says the Mass is a mystery. it is the single most important mystery, but through this you actually engage in this mystical act, and that the wafer and the wine are spiritually, invisibly to you, but in a very hyper-real sense, turned into the flesh and blood of Christ. This is what you believe. Mm-hmm. And you believe that not because it's been explained to you. Okay, this is how it happens. The molecules of the way. Okay, no, that's not, you don't go into any of that. You don't need any science. You simply believe in the efficacy and the mysticism of the Mass, whereas in Gnosticism, you have this explained to you. You come to spiritual enlightenment, well, often through a kind of experience, but an experience induced through knowledge. Mm. So, commonly Gnosticism is dualistic. It has very different guys. So the kind of theology behind this was that there's a kind of trinity. So let me go back a little bit. Before he formed the Agape Lodge, Wilfrid Smith, earlier in the 30s, incorporated under the laws of the state of California a tax-exempt religious organization called the Church of Thelema.
Okay.
Now, he needed to do that because if you tried to do it, Agape Lodge sounded to various California officials as if it was some sort of fraternal order. That's not a religion.
Yeah.
You don't get, well, as far as I know, the Elks Club doesn't get religious exemptions. But that's what they thought that would be. So he needed to do it as a religion, so it was called the Church of Thelema. So that then later gets sort of rolled into the Agape Lodge and the OTO. But that actually existed as a registered religious organization. And the whole idea is to have this body that will function as this vehicle for outreach. So the way that it would work is that they would host these Crowley nights. I mean, really, the whole idea was to get together and sort of study Crowley's works. Bible study. Okay, it's a Bible study. They're trying to organize their own form of Bible study, except it's, magic in theory and practice, or the book of the law. But they found that the way to attract people there was to basically host parties. And so one of the things that became known there is they're very, and you would sign the guest book. Okay, people would enter, and there's some names that show. So one of the names that's often mentioned is there's an actor in a lot of things, but mostly noted for horror movies, John Carradine, daddy to all of the other Carradines. And John Carradine attended meetings there at least twice at what was called the Profess House on Winona Boulevard, probably because he was going to play a Satanist organist in a Karloff Lugosi movie called The Black Cat. And so, you're doing research as an actor. These people, the general view was that these people are somehow devil worshippers, or they might be involved in black magic. So let's go there and see what it's like. Let's go to a Gnostic Mass and see what happens. I'll come back to the Gnostic Mass, which is not a black mass.
Okay.
Not at all. But so Carradine shows up, but he never joined. He was never initiated into anything. So statements later on that John Carradine, who was a member of the Bundy Drive Boys, which was this group of Hollywood hellraisers, including John Barrymore and Errol Flynn. No, he never actually joined the Agape Lodge or the OTO. He did come there for atmosphere because he was interested. But the other thing that tended to draw a lot of people in addition to the party, because the stories went that everything was said this was a love cult. Now, to be fair, the personal dynamics of the Agape Lodge. Now, keep in mind, the hardcore of that organization never number much more than about a dozen people. Mm-hmm. So Wilfrid Smith becomes the high priest. Regina Call, when his wife leaves him, she now becomes the high priestess. And it was, Regina Call up to that point had been mostly known as a lesbian. That is, almost all of her sexual relations were with women. When she became the high priestess, she apparently, dumped her girlfriends for Wilfrid Smith. They're all sleeping with each other. Okay, that's it. It's just, let's say, the attitude, particularly in the 30s, is the general attitude within the OTO towards sex is that everyone was pretty, anything was okay. And it was effectively, whether they wanted to say that or not, a free love commune in any respects. And husbands and wives were constantly switching partners. Okay. I mean, this is what would happen when Jack Parsons later joined.
Right.
Jack Parsons' wife, and he'd join it. Later, Jack Parsons' wife will end up married to Wilfrid Smith. And then Jack Parsons, in the meantime, is taken up with her little half-sister. Okay, then we go from there. Then you add L. Ron Hubbard to the mix, and it's chaos. So they always tried to downplay that it was a love cult or a kind of movable orgy, but that's effectively what it became. The other thing was that because of their very relaxed attitude towards sex, it also became a kind of gay meeting place. Now, at that time, gay bars in Los Angeles were being regularly raided by the police, but you could go to one of these Crowley nights on Winona Boulevard, and that became this kind of meeting place, and, it wasn't as if there was like a gay bar going on in the kitchen, but close to that. And one of the guys who was frequent, there was a guy named Harry Hay. Harry Hay would later become one of the leaders of the gay liberation movement, but he was also the guy in the 30s who played the organ at the Gnostic Mass at the OTO meeting. And would invite his other gay friends over because it was gay friendly.
Right.
So what actually happened in the Gnostic Mass? Was this, did they sacrifice a chicken? No, they didn't sacrifice anything. Did people have sex on the floor? Not usually, so far as I think that possibility. So it's basically this. So what was the whole credo of this thing? It was someplace I actually had the sort of credo of it. Let's put it this way. You have a kind of trinity. The trinity consists of chaos, which is kind of the Gnostic, all-Vater, distant God. There was chaos, and then there was Baphomet, the great beast, and then there was his consort, Babylon, or the Scarlet Woman. That was your trinity. And so the Gnostic Mass, the priest and the priestess sort of represented the beast and the Scarlet Woman. And it was a kind of ritual courtship, the two of them, as she would appear behind a veil, the priest would come up, he would have a symbolic wand that he would then, that's symbolic, that would then part the veil, and then there were all kinds of there was a lot of talking and then walking around 3 times. There was a lot of talking and walking and veils and the rest of it. And I think pretty much both he and the priestess were nude. Mm-hmm. Okay, so if you wanted to see a naked woman, okay, and you hadn't seen one lately, that was the place you would go to do it. But there's a lot of sexual suggestion in it, but that's generally as far as it would go. And then when it was all over, the sacrament would be distributed in terms of the cakes of light, which again would usually include bodily fluids. So extracted during sexual acts. But it was more or less a kind, and Regina Hall could get some costumes and everybody was, sort of decked out, or the people participating in it. You essentially had the priest and the priestess, the organist, who wasn't even a member of the organization itself. They were just hired as an organist. And then you had the deacon, who was the kind of MC. So there was a little psychodrama, which they acted out in front of that. But the Gnostic Mass is then also connected to something called the Gnostic Church. Okay, the Gnostic Catholic Church. It's not a branch of the Catholic Church. That was something actually formed back in the 19th century that the OTO observed. But then Crowley wrote the Gnostic Mass in Moscow, Russia, in 1913. He was there with a group of dancing girls as their manager. And I don't know, probably got high on something one evening and wrote out the Gnostic Mass. But that was sort of his contribution to. I mean, it's always one of the things, understanding that the OTO was this sort of invented organization that was to take over other societies. It was German in origin. Crowley will later carry off most of it as his own, add his Gnostic Mass to it, incorporate his AA into it. And so it's building these things in bits and pieces. It's one of the things I've suggested before about occult organizations and even occult belief systems is they're always like a kaleidoscope. They're always kind of changing and morphing before your eyes, jettisoning this and incorporating that. So the fundamental problem, particularly for Crowley, he's over in London and constantly complaining. Okay, what is it he wants? He wants you to initiate more people because you'll get initiation fees, and those initiation fees are to go to me. Okay, I need money. And one of the reasons I need money is I want to come to Hollywood, and so I want you to get more important people. I want you to get more members. I want more money. I want a ticket across the Atlantic and then a train ticket to Southern California. And Wilfrid Smith, I think, honestly seems to do his best as he can. We get lots of people in for the parties, but not a lot of people who really want to join. I think over time, maybe 50 or 60 people were initiated. Some advanced to the second grade. Most, I don't think, ever got much further than that. They would suspend operations every now and then. They sort of quit having the Mass and then they'd start it again. So Jack Parsons, the rocket scientist, maybe the most famous member, he and his wife show up as guests in early 1939. And he eventually will be initiated. And he'll take over leadership of the Agape Lodge in 1942-43 from Wilfrid Smith. Why? Because Crowley fires Smith. Mm-hmm. And the way he fires him is to go, you've basically failed as a leader of this. You haven't increased it. So you're not, you need more spiritual enlightenment. You must resign your position and go out to the desert on a spiritual quest to figure out what the hell's the matter with you.
Yeah, we covered this
in another.
Yeah.
So but Smith had done his best as far as I could see. And he had actually, now they did do things. Now, there are a couple of little interesting details. At one point, Smith writes to Crowley and he goes, look, we went down to Mount Palomar, which is down near San Diego. We went out into the wilderness and we consecrated a temple and we actually held a mass or a ritual there. So that's kind of interesting because now this is long before Jack Parsons comes along.
Yeah.
I think it's even before the lodge is formally formed in Hollywood, but we went down there to Palomar, which figures in so many other little minor mysteries, and we consecrated this ground. There were also at least two efforts to buy property, again, down in the Palomar, down in a place called a valley not too far from there, in the rural area of Southern California, to buy property. One of these places actually had a house where Crowley could go and live. Uh-huh. And a couple of these were members. There was a guy by the name of Culling who owned like 600 acres, and he was going to give them like 200 acres of it, and that they could build their own sort of colony. Now, what he wanted them to do was to build a kind of commune where everybody would work on the farm and study the book of the law. And that really wasn't what Smith wanted, and it wasn't necessarily what Crowley wanted. That never happened. Okay, they just never got enough money together, and that was I think that's ultimately why Crowley became so dissatisfied with it. Another problem with that was the staunch opposition of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI to letting Aleister Crowley in the country. So J. Edgar Hoover had first become acquainted with Crowley's name back in 1918 when Crowley had been investigated by military intelligence and by the New York State Attorney General and by the FBI. So I think it's in the fall of 1918, maybe 1919, there's an FBI agent that interviews Aleister Crowley, and he sends that, as everyone did, back to Hoover. He was head of what's then called the General Intelligence Division, which was looking for things like spies and revolutionaries. So Hoover knew Crowley's name as far back as 1918. And he was reminded of Crowley, and what he was reminded of was that Crowley was a moral degenerate, as it was described, who was probably a German propagandist during the war. And now this same moral degenerate who somehow had gotten himself back into the good graces of the British and allowed to live in London wanted to come to the United States. Well, Hoover personally said there's no way in hell this guy ever going to get in the country. So that was the other, even him getting a permission, a visa to get into the country or any kind of, would have been blocked in that regard. But there was an effort to get him there. So, if you put all of these pieces together, what kind of influence during its, and let's put it this way, the Agape Lodge of the OTO was formed by Wilfrid Smith in, let's say, early 1935. It functioned on and off up until about 1951. Jack Parsons briefly took control when Smith was cast aside. Parsons was pretty much out of it by 45. I don't think he formally resigns from it until 46, but he gets interested in other things. He's not really around that long. Roy Leffingwell, the DJ, takes over. Now, here was a little detail I came across just from looking in newspapers. Sure. I had been told some years before that the OTO had an office or a presence on the Sunset Strip.
Like Scientology kind of?
Yeah, kind of like that. And the impression they got, they had a presence there either, they thought the presence was there in the 60s. But it did turn out that in 1945, they did actually, not in the Sunset Strip, but on Sunset Boulevard at a kind of shopping plaza, a themed shopping plaza called Crossroads of the World, which is still there. They actually rented a space and had and gave OTO lectures. They were trying to attract people. I think they were trying to appeal to returning war vets, because this is like in July and summer of 1945. And they did. They advertised in local LA papers and said, come learn about Aleister Crowley on Sunset Boulevard at Crossroads of the World. But that pretty quickly folded. After Parsons leaves, the kind of sad history after that, or not so sad history, is that Crowley eventually appoints his designated successor, a German former intelligence officer by the name of Karl Germer, to come in, and Germer just thinks everybody in LA is stupid, and they're all just running a sex cult. He thinks they're all pretty much useless, and is so disgusted with the whole thing that when he later succeeds Crowley as head of the OTO after Crowley dies and Germer is anointed the successor, he shuts the whole thing down. He just says, we're not going to initiate anybody anymore because you're all such basically a pack of losers. I don't think he uses that exact term, but that was his attitude, fairly or not. So, if you go through all of this, it wouldn't appear that the OTO had any more than an extremely fringe presence anywhere in Hollywood. There's no significance that it ever influenced anyone of real power. Now, that, of course, flies in the face of what I said at the beginning, which was the statement in Michael Hoffman's book on secret societies and psychological warfare, that the OTO was very successful in recruiting people in terms of authors and screenwriters, etc. From the existing records of the Agape Lodge, which are fairly complete,
Yeah.
there's nothing to suggest that. The interesting thing is that in Hoffman's book, he mentions this supposed important producer who went under the pseudonym of M. Balcon, Balcon. So I just did some sort of hunting around by that, and you know, you're looking for who might that be. Oh, they were connected with MGM. He mentions that they were connected with MGM. And what I did find is that there was a person who actually was called, not an alias, Michael Balcon, later Sir Michael Balcon, and they were an important executive in MGM in Britain.
Okay.
In fact, Michael Balcon headed Ealing Studios, produced a lot of famous comedies, was influential in bringing Alec Guinness into prominence. And in 1936, in the middle of the 30s, he spent the better part of a year in Hollywood, sort of, I don't know, learning various things before going back. So almost all of his career was in MGM in Britain, but he did have a presence there at the time that the Agape Lodge existed. But so far as I can tell, there's no connection between his name and the Agape Lodge. And M. Balcon was his actual name. Now, maybe what happened here is that Michael Balcon attended the Agape Lodge in Hollywood under another assumed name. Maybe that's why it got mixed up. M. Balcon is his real name. The other interesting thing about him is that Michael Balcon knew two people who knew Crowley in Britain. One was the spy Maxwell Knight, who had some acquaintance with Crowley, and then the other was the writer Dennis Wheatley, who also wrote for films in Britain as well. So he was only one, he knew people who knew Aleister Crowley, which raises the chances that he might have as well, but none of it suggests that he was ever the head of, he ever belonged to the OTO, which he may have been. So that to me is kind of an interesting question, and it raises the possibility, and the possibility only, that was there some kind of Crowleyite or Thelemic organization or group in Hollywood that functioned outside or separately from the Agape Lodge? Now, it wouldn't surprise me that Wilfrid Smith and his, group of inconsequential followers for the most part might have been unaware of that, but there's no way that Crowley would have been aware of it. Mm-hmm. And if there was some other group headed by Balcon or anyone else in Hollywood that Crowley was aware of, he would never have stopped telling Wilfrid Smith about that. So as far as Crowley can tell, Wilfrid Smith and later Jack Parsons were the only two front men that he ever had there. The other possibility, I think, is that there was a very slight possibility, is that when the original German OTO fractured in the 20s, and Crowley walked away with most of it, there were other German groups that had been affiliated roughly with Royce's OTO that, while some of them accepted Thelema, they never really accepted Crowley as their leader, or did so in only in a very nominal way. And one of those was a group that sort of came out of the original OTO called the Brotherhood of Saturn, the Fraternitas Saturni. And that became a small but functional group in Germany, at least up through the Nazi era, when it, along with the OTO, was broken up. And there was an exodus, there was a large exodus of people from Germany leaving the Nazi period in the film, German Jews and others who came to Hollywood in that period. So you have this kind of anti-Nazi exodus into Hollywood. Mm-hmm. So I've wondered whether or not within those exiles, within those German exiles that came into Hollywood in that period, was there some sort of small cell of the Fraternitas Saturni? And did they, with this kind of some connection to the sort of Crowleyan milieu, there's that word again, is that what sometimes was mistaken for a being? Is there something else in the background that was functioning that perhaps even Crowley wasn't aware of, that was then later connected to or confused with the OTO? An interesting question. So there, all together, I guess there's one last thing I would kind of bring in here. I mentioned earlier, didn't explain. I tend to do that a lot, but I will. Let's come back to it. Crowley's AA, his personal mystical order. What did AA stand for? And I said that nobody really knew. And there are different ideas. The one that you'll most commonly see is that it's connected to the concept of the silver star. So that is Argentium Astrum, the silver star.
Okay.
But that's not clear that that's what it means at all. And another idea is that it stands for Astron Argon, which is a more Greek way of saying the same thing. Aster Argos was another one. Atlantean Adepts, American sci-fi writer L. Sprague de Camp said, now it stands for the Adepts of Atlantis or the Atlantean Adepts. See, either one would work. Or maybe it stands for Angel and the Abyss. Or maybe it stands for Arcanum Arcanorum, the Secret of Secrets.
Anonymous. Yeah.
Or maybe another one said it says for Arik Anpin, which is supposedly an Aramaic word that means silver star.
Okay.
It's not clear that that's actually Aramaic. But the most interesting explanation to me comes from the writer Robert Anton Wilson. Cosmic Trigger. Masks of the Illuminati, Robert Anton Wilson.
All right.
So his idea, what did AA stand for? Nothing. It was just AA. The A didn't stand for anything. So you'd go spin yourself into circles trying to figure out what two words that start with A could possibly be there, but that the actual secret you would learn is that it doesn't stand for anything. So, that's kind of the story, as far as I can piece it together, of Aleister Crowley in Hollywood. But one last little thing. What became of that guy, Carl de Vidal Hunt? Well, did he succeed in restoring Crowley's reputation? No. Their connection actually briefly preceded Crowley being expelled from France as a spy and possible drug dealer. So, in fact, his mere association with Carl de Vidal Hunt seems to have been the last straw to allow the French to allow him to live in the country. David L. Hunt he was a kind of syndicated Hearst reporter. He wrote stories about, famous divorce cases, murder cases. And then he stayed on in Germany through the Nazi era and then died in Berlin of a heart attack in 1937. So that ends that little story as well. So that's it for today.